Republican here to bring you the truth with truth-flavored bias. Today I'm beginning a new series where I look at the hidden agenda of the Final Fantasy video game series, stretching from Final Fantasy IV all the way to Final Fantasy X. And I'm starting with Final Fantasy IV, which was released here in the United States as Final Fantasy II. And the version that I played was the Super Nintendo version. There are other versions of the game that have come out since, but I've never played them. But I have found art up from them and information about them. I've checked out the wiki and done a lot of research on this video. So without any further ado, let's get going. Final Fantasy IV was the moral tipping point of the Final Fantasy series. Before, it had all been about spells, swords, and dragons, which some Christians are uncomfortable with, but personally I'm not that bothered by it. And it started becoming this kind of elitist, globalist, commie and queer agenda type of thing with Final Fantasy IV, and it was built into the story. The story itself, many of the images, many of the characters, and many of the events that they make you go through are promoting these kind of ideas, and they're trying to ingrain these ideas in the minds of impressionable young children. And I think that my own development was most likely damaged by games like this when I was a child. However, since I've thought about this over the years, I've been able to undo the damage and learn a lot from it, and I hope to help you do the same thing. At the beginning, we meet Cecil, the leader of an airship that goes around making raids on behalf of the king, and he is in the middle of stealing a crystal from someone. Now, he eventually decides that this raid was unjust and decides to betray his king. So basically, he's supposed to be our hero, but his first act is treason. He takes an airship built by the tax dollars of the people of a kingdom and collected by their king, and he steals it and uses it for his personal ends and turns the men on that ship into traitors with him. So already that's a pretty dire start, and it's something that is easy to overlook since the game glosses over it so quickly. Now back to Cecil. He is one of the more interesting and emotionally complex of the Final Fantasy protagonists. Now, the thing about Cecil that's weird is that he's actually 37 in a game and a game series where almost every major character is about 20 years old, give or take. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about Rosa, his love interest, and Kain, his best friend slash love rival. So Cecil is a 37-year-old Dark Knight. So basically he's someone who was raised by the king. He's called the Dark Knight. That's like his nickname. And it was basically making him out to be somebody like a Batman or a Bruce Wayne. However, that part of the story never fully gets told. So all we know is that people really respect Cecil, and I guess that makes sense since he's a little older than these other guys, and he probably taught them a lot of their moves. So he probably trained Rosa. He was like her teacher. And then he took advantage of the situation. So there is some darkness about Cecil. He's not a perfect hero because he basically is taking advantage of a much younger woman, and he's also screwing over his supposed friend Kain by taking Rosa from Kain. Rosa is a fantastic love interest, but not a very good character. What do I mean by that? Well, she is a fantastic lover to Cecil because she's completely submissive and subordinate, and that's odd in a Final Fantasy game. Most of the characters represent moral decay and depravity, but Rosa is sort of your typical feminine virtue. The problem is, she's the typical feminine virtue who is associating herself with people like Cecil and Kain and Rydia and all these other characters who are degenerates. She sort of represents like the good Christian girl who is too naive to realize that the people around her are degenerate scum. And that brings us to Kain, whose nickname is the Dragoon. He is the third wheel in the Cecil and Rosa relationship. He is someone who was in love with Rosa, and it was his great love for Rosa that was used against him by the forces that end up manipulating him in the game. Now, Kain is also a very good warrior. He has a super cool jump command, and if you look at both his armor and consider his nickname of the Dragoon, then you know that he has a connection with dragons, which implies that he's both wise and strong. And later on in the game, when he returns to the team, he ends up becoming the best character and the de facto leader of the group. And here is the worst character in the Final Fantasy series. Definitely in this game, probably in the entire goddamn series. Prince Edward the Musician. He brings no value to your team, and anytime he's in your party, you're the worst for it. He is basically the Kwame Brown of the Final Fantasy universe. And this gives you an idea of what he looked like when this game was re-released on the PlayStation 1. He is clearly intended to be a homosexual. Now, I did not pick up on the fact that Edward was a homosexual when I played as a child on the SNES, and it was only as a teenager when I revisited this game that I picked up on the obvious cues, like the fact that he's playing a flute and that he has no fighting ability and that he's timid. All these signs are of a homosexual. And he's being upheld in a kind of affirmative action where Cecil and Cain and other real men are there to uphold Edward's throne for him. So this is basically a kind of pro-gay rights statement that even if you have homosexuals who are unable to defend themselves, they should be defended by what I guess the SJWs call cis-hetero males, which I think is complete and total nonsense. If gays can't defend themselves, then they don't deserve to be defended at all. Why not just teach them to use weapons and fight like normal people? I just don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. And this game promotes that. It promotes weakness and patheticness. Rydia, the pagan magician. Now, unlike Edward, she is really, really, really good in the game. You basically build your party around Rydia's ability to destroy shit. However, she also is arguably the most morally compromised member of the team. She was expected to give up her childhood in order to get strong enough to defeat Golbez and the other bad guys. So she fell off a ship and then came back as a grown woman after only being a 7-year-old girl before. So that is odd, and the fact that Cecil is known as a 37-year-old who dates much younger women makes it even odder and, in retrospect, deeply disturbing. But Rydia does represent the power of pagan magic, and she is more or less an openly anti-Christian character, so I can't really like her that much. However, if I ever had to play this game again, there's no way I could avoid using her. Obviously, you put her in instead of Edward, since she isn't a homosexual and she can fight. The last playable character is another prince named Edge, who is a trained ninja, and he joins your party about midway through the game. Now, the weird thing about Edge being a ninja is that if you know anything about Chinese history, you know that ninjas were lower class assassins, not upper class aristocratic warriors. So this is a weird way of trying to turn history on its head and misinform the public. For years, I always assumed that being a ninja was something fit for a king, when in reality it's something fit for the son of a gardener or the son of a McDonald's worker. Anyway, Edge is another character who's really good in the game, but he represents not good things. He also has a huge crush on Rydia, which is weird because keep in mind, even though Rydia comes back looking like an adult woman, she's still in fact a 7 or 8-year-old child. But it's not terribly surprising that Edge doesn't have good guidance because, as we learn in the game, his parents have become demons and he has to kill them, which is one of the saddest moments in the entire Final Fantasy series. It causes you to have sympathy for demons, which is not a good thing. Demons are not your friends. And it also explains why Edge ends up having a crush on a little girl, since he's taking his cues about sexuality and relationships from an older person in Cecil, who again is a 37-year-old who dates 20-year-olds. So it does, in a weird way, highlight the importance of family and the importance of having a good role model. And that's why I think, even though Final Fantasy IV has all kinds of problems and the worst are yet to come, it is still morally superior to its successor games. The bad guy for most of Final Fantasy IV is Golbez. He manipulates a lot of people and has a grand alliance against Cecil and his friends. And it looks like Golbez is more or less Satan. You can see that in the way he's designed and the way he acts. But then we learn that he actually was a tool himself, and that he wasn't really responsible for a lot of the bad things that he was doing. And what that teaches is that kids should be sympathetic to bad guys. So kids should be really lenient on killers and shooters and Black Lives Matter and all these other groups that are out there doing terrible things, or ISIS. Now, the other major problem theologically, and this is a bigger one than the social problems I just pointed out, is that it says that we should have sympathy for Satan, because in no uncertain terms, Golbez is Satan. He is the antithesis of Fusuyo, who is the godlike figure in this game. And ultimately it turns out that they're allies, but God and Satan cannot be allies. And if you're wondering why the hell I'm talking about all this biblical stuff, well, let's think about it again. Cain, the character we met earlier, was clearly based on the biblical Cain. He, like the biblical Cain, was ultimately jealous of his brother, well, his brother-in-arms in this case, and betrayed him, and then went on a journey afterwards. Well, there's another major biblical reference, and that reference is the Tower of Babel, which is drawn directly from the Bible. Now, to be cute about it, the Chinese people who developed this game took the spellings and changed them. So instead of Cain with the K, it's Cain with a C. Instead of Babel with an E, it's Babel with an I. You can see how clever they are. Okay, so making a biblical reference by calling a tower the Tower of Babel isn't really that bad, is it? Well, what if I told you that Final Fantasy IV has an entire map underground, an entire world down there with its own kingdoms? You can live underground, and like hell, which is underground, there's lava everywhere and it's really hot. But in this hell, it's fantasy-based. There are dwarves and tanks. And Rydia's powers are unleashed in this place, as if she's some sort of demon who gets special abilities in this environment. And it also turns out that this Tower of Babel, which emerges on the Earth, starts and has its base in hell. So basically the designers of this game are either saying that the Christian faith is from Satan, or they're saying something else that's not entirely clear. I'm actually not 100% sure what the implications of that could be, other than that they are basically just trying to demolish the faith of American Christians. Everything up until this point has been designed to weaken the faith of the gamer in God. And now that they've loosened up your faith and really gotten into your head, the designers reveal in the last portion of the game their true agenda. And that is to advance the ancient astronaut theory. Now, Cecil and his friends find an ancient spaceship that is in the shape of a giant well. And that seems a little weird, but remember that a lot of aircraft, like the famous P-51s called the Flying Tigers in World War II, were painted with shark teeth, and those were supposed to intimidate the Japanese. Now, and given that these designers are also from Asia, they also found this to be intimidating, so they wanted a spaceship which looked intimidating, because it would have to come from a technologically advanced and intimidating culture. So you get on this well, and you can fly it to the moon. And that is all kinds of weird. And not only does it promote ancient astronaut theory, since as we'll see when the story gets to the moon, it turns out that the people of the moon are like gods or something, but it also promotes the unproven claim that man has actually been to the moon on several occasions. But the fact is, if you look into the Apollo moon landings and you read your history, you realize that the evidence for that is scanty and circumstantial. once we get to the moon, we learn the truth behind the entire game universe. It turns out that Golbez is actually Cecil's brother, that they are both Lunarians, or moon men, that there's another person who is another relative of theirs called Fasuyo, and that there is yet another person there called Zemus, who has been manipulating everything all along. And Zemus's agenda is to have the Lunarians on Earth wake up and transform the Earth into a livable environment for the Lunarians, despite the fact the moon is clearly livable, since you can get right off the ship and walk around with no spacesuit. So there's a lot of weird stuff in this, and I think the main agenda of the game is to promote the idea that there is a eugenically engineered master race, the ruling elite, the establishment, whatever you want to call them, who were put here by aliens, and that our religions and values were things given to us by aliens and then manipulated through special people or aliens who forgot their identity, and that there is like a space overlord out there watching over everything that we do and controlling everything. So basically, if that were the case, then the Tower of Babel, which was giving the world religion, if you will, was controlled by these aliens, and it was part of their plan. It was an indirect, misleading thing to enable them to set up their real agenda and actually seize power of the Earth and manipulate people and exploit the resources of the Earth. And Cecil, ultimately, despite being a Lunarian, will foil this plot, but if you really think about it, the only reason he actually did that is so he could keep plowing Rosa, who was really hot and a lot younger. Anyway, the game is pretty degenerate if you actually know what you're looking for. However, it's not nearly as in your face, and there are some family values in the game on some level. Anyway, when we get to Final Fantasy V and VI, though, you'll see that the programmers of this game really went off the rails and fell victim to degeneracy soon after this game was made. Until then, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with truth-flavored bias, signing out.